Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and in particular, clients of CTB. My name is JP, and I'm the Training Compliance Officer at CTB. It is a privilege for me to take you through the notice amendments of the General Code of Conduct of 2020, in particular with reference to complaints management. The agenda for the session is set out as follows. We will be dealing with some key definitions. We'll be looking at the complaints management framework. We would be looking at the complaints handling and resolution policy and procedures, the customer complaint submission process, and then as we go through the session, we will make some time for general comments and content, as well as at the end of the session. First and foremost, I'd like to set out what in fact has changed in respect to the General Code of Conduct. And with particular reference to the definition of a complaint, which is now referred to as an expression of dissatisfaction by a person to a provider or to the knowledge of the provider, and in particular with reference to a financial product or a financial service provided. So when we start to look at the discussion around expression of dissatisfaction, I believe it is imperative to extract from that two definitions, one in respect of a complaint and the second in respect of a dissatisfaction. If we go to the dictionary definition of complaint, in particular, it would refer to a statement that is something unsatisfactory or unacceptable, a reason for dissatisfaction, and or an expression of a dissatisfaction. And similarly, when we look at the definition of a dissatisfaction, it's the state or attitude of not being satisfied, being discontent or displeased, or a particular cause or feeling of displeasure or disappointment. And as you can see, the more we start to discuss the issues around dissatisfaction and or complaint, it's quite easy for there to be an emotional response in respect of the matter at hand, causing the dissatisfaction or causing the grievance or nature, so-called, to be a complaint in respect of the matter at hand. It is, however, important to try and qualify any conversations that you're having with clients, because the new articulation of the definition in terms of the Phase Act really requires FSPs to scrutinize the elements, the factual elements in particular, in respect of any grievance or dissatisfaction that may be raised by our clients. When we're trying to qualify that routinely and in a formal manner in respect of what the legislation requires, we are looking to qualify the conversation or expressions by a client or customer, or so to speak, a complainant, in the following categories A, B, and C, which can be seen on the extract from the legislation on the right-hand side of this particular slide. A, we are looking at, is the expression of dissatisfaction or complaint in relation to the provider or its service supplier, where there has been a contravention or failure to comply with an agreement, a law, a rule, or a code of conduct which is binding on the provider or to which the provider subscribes. Is the dissatisfaction or complaint in relation to the provider or its service supplier's maladministration or willful or negligent action or failure to act, where harm has been caused to the person? Has there been any element of prejudice, distress, or substantial inconvenience that has come to cause in respect of this dissatisfaction in the matter of the business relationship that's being dealt with? Or is there any element of the provider or its service supplier where the customer or complainant or anybody acting on behalf of the customer or complainant, where such person has been treated unfairly through the duration of the business relationship? If your conversation with a client qualifies in any of those categories, the new requirements require the FSP or service provider, product house administrator, and or other service provider conduit to the relationship with the FSP and its client may need to treat the expression of dissatisfaction or grievance or inconvenience or disappointment or displeasure or nature of discontent in a formal manner to then qualify and resolve the matter as if it were a complaint. So it's quite important to then dig down to the factual elements of what we are dealing with in respect of the customer, with the sole intention to resolve matters, but more specifically to treat customers fairly. And as we can see, as we go through this presentation, we'll start to see the themes envisaged through the roadmap towards TCF where the highest regard must be held for customers in their best interest, but ultimately for all parties at hand, and also the integrity of the industry altogether. In respect of the complaints management framework, it's quite important that clients have a certain expectation in terms of what they would expect from a management framework or a complaints procedure. And in response, FSPs need to have certain elements in place to ensure that there is a procedure and protocol that clients who have grievances, who have dissatisfactions and or formal complaints, that they're able to channel those through the FSP provider, product house, administration house, and other service suppliers in respect of how they need to go about raising their concerns and what they can expect in the resolution process. In the first instance, it is critically important for there to be a user-friendly handling system available to clients. Clients want to be heard and understood. Clients want to be respected through the process, but most certainly want to feel a client-centered experience in their responses, but also they want to have an organization who cares about the feedback that clients are providing to them. Remember, it is important to use this process and this procedure or protocol in the business or organization or your establishment to ensure that clients understand that they will receive a response and explanation in an attempt to resolve matters that may be causing grievance or dissatisfaction of sorts. Clients also want to be partnered with a business where there are quick action, where there is quick action, swift action taken by the organization in the resolution affairs that may need to be articulated and composed in respect of the clients and their proceedings. So at any point in time, clients want to have this well-rounded approach. They want to see an effective administration process and a skillful process at that, with the intention to resolve matters that may be of grievance and or concern. Similarly, in response to what clients would expect to see, FSPs need to have a user-friendly handling system to receive the feedback. FSPs, providers, product houses, administration houses, whether client-facing directly or not, it is important that each entity or establishment have a complaints management procedure and or framework of their own, for in the event that there's a concern or a grievance of some sort that is raised. But all entities need to treat this as a channel of feedback from clients, where clients can openly, without prejudice and without the response being such that they feel uncomfortable loading these complaints or raising these grievances. It's a channel of positive feedback. And so what we have the opportunity to do again is considering the envisaged roadmap towards TCF and a culture of client-centeredness in the approach is to resolve matters, improve reputation of organizations, improve the handling proceedings in respect of customers, to overall use the feedback that is coming from the framework within FSPs, providers, product houses, etc., where feedback and the data that comes with that on the basis of factual elements and information from the cases that will be raised would then be constructively used within the organization to ensure ongoing organizational improvements in dealings with customers overall. So within respect of FSPs, we need to have a user-friendly handling system, clear delegations, who is dealing with it, how the matters will be dealt with, and what are the time frames within which customers can expect feedback. There must be a system for capturing complaint data factually. So as a CTB customer, you do have access to the electronic platform known as Cotiv, and Cotiv offers a nice system and mechanism to ensure that all matters relating to complaints and or dissatisfactions are simply enabled to be captured onto a central base where all the information and records can be kept. We've already said that complaint data must be used to identify trends and problems. This could be service-related issues, it could be systemic issues, it could be fundamental issues within the business that perhaps need to be enhanced or improved, or controls need to be changed, or perhaps it could be a simple element, something such as training of representatives of the organization to ensure that we are addressing the matters that may be coming from these complaints on an ongoing basis. There is certainly no exhaustive list in terms of the nature of complaints one could receive, how many complaints, volumes, where they're coming from, etc. But it's important to start to use or devise a process whereby complaints can be used for reflection, basically, within the business and upon representatives and or upon service providers that may be conduit to the business relationship you as providers and FSPs share with your clients. It's important to take all feedback on a positive and constructive basis to improve service delivery in the identified areas across the board. So identified areas, again, could be within the FSP, it could be a segment of the FSP. Perhaps it's improvements required within and amongst the representatives of an organization that are perhaps under supervision. Perhaps it's more training in terms of product. Perhaps it's more training in respect of disclosure requirements or material information that should be made available to clients in respect of product information. So that, you know, there's quite a long list and it's quite broad in its definition in terms of what can be used and construed for positive improvements in any establishment party to the relationship with the customer. Through an effective complaints handling system, we need to achieve a few things. In the first instance, we have to enable submission. Submission of complaints must be customer focused. The submission process must be visible and accessible. The process must be well regarded and valued by the organization internally and supported by management. The complaints handling system must acknowledge and respond to clients. So responses need to be prompt in nature. Matters need to be objectively handled in a fair manner and confidentially. It is also important at any point in time to evaluate the unique customer arrangements that you have with your different customer sets, be it in respect of different product categories where you have customers, or perhaps you've just got customers of different nature altogether. There's no one person who buys a particular financial product that will respond to the nature of that financial product in any particular way. So it's important through the process to remain personalized and unique to the relationship that you share with your customer, but non-personal. So at all times, rather remain professional, don't become heated in the response process, rather remain composed, remain factual, remove any emotion out of the situation, and ensure that all dealings in relation to complaints matters or dissatisfaction or grievance matters that are raised by the customer or anybody acting on behalf of the customer, that such can be dealt with in a fair and professional manner. So throughout the acknowledgement and response process, there will be cases where complaints are upheld and or outright rejected, or potentially even found wholly or partially in favor of the particular complainant or customer. At any point in time, the customer may well express further dissatisfaction in respect of their complaint not being fully resolved to their satisfaction, in which case the process and procedure and methodology that is adopted by the organization should ensure that there's a system for proper review and escalation of the matter at hand. And that is where then accountabilities start to come into the equation. Clear accountabilities must be established. So there must be, for example, a complaints officer that is nominated with the responsibility of dealing with complaints on behalf of the organization. Representatives of the organization may well become involved in the complaints handling procedure, i.e. be the complaint handlers themselves, requiring the support of then the complaints officer to sign off on any responses and or remedies or restitutions, resolutions that may be on offer to the client, but ultimately also allowing the organization then to learn from the matters, take the factual information, take the data, the trends, the various natures that will be spread quite across different complaints, different segments of the business relationship that you share with multiple clients in the organization. But ultimately, this is a channel of feedback that should be used to stimulate organizational improvements within each of your establishments. When we are dealing with the objectives and the principles relating to the complaints handling process, we're really dealing with three categories. We're dealing with the enabling of the complaint submission. We are dealing with responding to complaints, and then furthermore accountability and learning. And some of this is a reiteration of some of the things that we've already said. But the principles and objectives that we hope to achieve through each of those categories. In respect of the complaint submission process, Complaints need to be effectively and efficiently handled. The feedback that is coming from complaints from customers need to be valued by the organization. So used and constructed in a positive manner to stimulate improvements in the business relationship that you share with current and or future clients. Information in the process must be available with guidelines to customers and or complainants with where, how, and to whom to submit a complaint for ease of access to customers. So it must be visible, it must be accessible. An example could be, it could be displayed and or attached in the public domain on your website if you are actively pursuing your website through client engagements. And or other opportunities would be to include the process and procedural guidelines on where and how and to whom to submit a complaint as part of a tagline to an email signature, or perhaps, for example, if you have got your client file with your annual review ready for your client, it is important then to take the client through the process and procedure should they feel the need that at any time there's a problem and or a concern that they may need to raise with the organization. When we are talking about the response to complaints, or at least the principles for responding to complaints, it's important that complaints are acknowledged in a timely manner, usually within 24 hours. Thereafter, to address complaints promptly, but in order of urgency. So you might be having a case of 5 complaints in the same week. So volumes are not significant. However, 5 complaints in an ideal world is perhaps far too many that any organization may want to be dealing with. But at the same time, the urgency of the complaints may well be different one to the other because of the fact that the priority of the case or the nature of the case dictating thus the priority may be different one to the other. So all complaints or grievances or dissatisfactions that are then raised must be acknowledged in a timely manner, as already said, within a space of about 24 hours. And then furthermore, you have the ability in the process then to assess the nature of the complaints and then prioritize the urgency of the response. Then to give the client clear direction within a further 48 hours to help them understand what are the facts of the matter that are being dealt with, how are they going to be considered, who will be dealing with the complaint, and what is the time frame that will be expected in respect of dealing with the complaint or the matter at hand. It is important on a regular basis throughout the interactions in dealing with complaints to keep the complainant or customer informed. So progress feedback, at least on a weekly basis, is important to clients to keep them updated in respect of how the complaint's being handled and at least how the progress is going to find resolution to the matter at hand. Furthermore, it is not possible to charge, in respect of the legislation and the regulatory guidelines, to charge the client for the time taken. So no FSP provider, product house, admin house, and or other service provider involved or conduit to the business relationship with the customer who may complain. No establishment may charge the client in respect of the time taken to handle the particular matter at hand and take the time to resolve and respond. So it's important to always, to as much as far as practically possible, deal with the matter in an equitable, objective and unbiased manner to ensure fair and reasonable outcomes and responses to clients in every instance. The matters must be dealt with confidentially. Appropriate remedies must be considered and resolved, and restitution, resolution, and otherwise must be communicated to the client in order with the intention to resolve the matters at hand. Where matters cannot be resolved, a clear process for review and or escalation must be articulated to the client. In the first instance, responding to the client to help them understand why a matter cannot be fully resolved and or resolved to their satisfaction, or why a particular matter is outright rejected on the basis of the facts that have been raised in respect of the matter. So a further process for review and escalation must be articulated to the client. When we're talking about accountabilities and learning, it's important that accountabilities are clearly established. So who within the organization, on behalf of the organization, together with a senior channel for escalation, who is taking the lead and or responsibility in handling complaints on behalf of the FSP provider, admin house, product house, and or other service provider that may be conduit to the business relationship with the client of the FSP. When we are talking further about complaints and responses, it's important that complaints and various responses thereto are monitored and reported onto the governing body. Over the last many years, We've noticed FSPs moving from a more tick box type approach to compliance to a more risk-based approach. And for that reason, we're calling it the governing body for purposes of the presentation, but it may well be the most senior leadership within the organization. It could solely be, for example, the key individual, or it could be an executive team, for example, within the organization that is responsible for governance in general and overall on behalf of the FSP provider, admin house, product house, and or other service supplier. It's important that there is executive leadership or the highest level of authority within an establishment that then becomes aware of the fact that complaints in the first instance are coming into the business, the fact that they're being dealt with, the volumes, the number of complaints that are coming in, the nature of the complaints, how long it is taking to resolve those complaints. Is it a case of the volumes of complaints and the nature thereof are largely reportable complaints, or are they more routine, less complex complaints that are not reportable but are still being recorded with the intention to resolve matters and with the intention to reflect internally and ensure organizational improvements in service delivery, both in the instance of the client and as well as ensuring that the product houses, service providers, admin houses are all part of the chain of service delivery to the business relationship at hand. And so that overall improvements are stimulated through the factual information and the constructive manner in which the complaints data and or feedback is received. So at any instance, it should be very clear that at all points and interactions that the best interest and the most high regard kept in value is that of the customer. So what are the client's best interests here? Have they been treated fairly? Have we all collectively upheld the integrity of the industry? Have we done right by our client and or society in general? You know, is there a real sense of client-centeredness coming through the organization? So who articulates the accountability? Who's responsible for determining whose responsibilities lie within the complaints management process and methodologies, and who will be taking the lead in dealing with these and customers? That same person will need to project manage the factual elements of what comes from the nature of the complaints to start building trends and or records that will start to help as a source of improvement in service delivery on all fronts, to not only the customer set, as we've already said, but also any component of that business relationship that may require improvement, whether it be a service related issue and or systemic issues. It could be a protocol, it could be a system, it could be as simple as updating an SLA to consider any improvements in the process that may need to be adhered to going forward. So, you know, we've got to think quite broadly, we've got to think quite wholly about what it is that we're trying to achieve in respect of customers, but most certainly with a strong hold in terms of pulling through the ethos of what we would see through the roadmap in business towards TCF. So quite important to take all of that into consideration as we articulate and or enhance these processes within an existing establishment and or improving those processes and procedures and or establishing a new process and procedure overall. In respect of an effective complaints handling system, there are absolutely benefits that will come through the process. The first and most important benefit that we can all gain through an effective complaints handling process and or methodology is to resolve issues. Largely, FSPs, providers, admin houses, product houses, and other service suppliers have got customers today because they've resolved issues for customers. On an ongoing basis, as advisors, as intermediaries in the market, you continue to resolve problems with customers, problems in relation to products, services that come with those products, benefits and or advantages and or gains that exist within those products, perhaps the performance of the product. But ultimately, the first and most important benefit one can gain is to strengthen the relationship with customers and or future customers through the resolution of issues. Through the collection of data, through using the information that will come through the channels that you make available for this feedback from your clients, you can certainly most importantly, once again, almost to the equivalent in nature to resolving issues, is to use factual information, data, sentiment that is coming from these cases that are being raised as matters from clients, is to stimulate improvements overall. So organizational improvements, improvements in training, improvements in the development of representatives of an FSP, for example. You could make this process and procedure, or the interaction or the sentiment and the dealings that go with that, formulated that as part of the development program for representatives that are under supervision in the organization. And we've already said that matters may not necessarily only be raised against the FSP. So concerns and or matters and grievances and or dissatisfactions, complaints formally, might not be specifically directed at the FSP or its representatives, but may well be directed at the actual product, which is party to the business relationship. And on that basis, the product itself may need to be evaluated. This SLA under which the product operates may need to be evaluated. Or ultimately, we would need to understand if there are systemic issues within the product house, admin house, other service provider that may be conduit to the business relationship, where there are issues that perhaps may require improvement. Furthermore, the benefit of an effective complaints handling system will most certainly allow the opportunity to improve reputation. So through a good administrative process, a good handling team, a process and procedure that will strengthen the confidence amongst your existing customer set and or inviting a future customer set into doing business with you. Certainly a lot is opened up through a good process. And it is important through these processes and procedures and methodologies to really consider that the relationship you have with the customer and or complainant in this particular case, given the nature of the topic that we're talking about, it's important that customers do understand that the process that you would go through in the event that there is a complaint is a reciprocal process. So it's reciprocal on the basis of the fact that you have a good administration system, you are offering the time and attention adequately to resolve with the intention to resolve matters. However, if there are matters that require input from the customer, it's important that they understand it's a transparent process. It's not a personal attack. It's merely a request for more information to ensure that for the benefit of the most reasonable and fair outcome, perhaps in their interest, but more importantly for the interest and improvement of all parties, with the cornerstone being a client-centered approach and or a process allowing for resolution, thus becomes an open response and an open process where the customer may participate. In that instance, where customers then do participate, it's important that we remain calm, we remain composed in the process, we remain professional and factual, so that we can see that there is with the intention to uphold the client's best interest, but also, they need to feel that they want to be respected, they want to be heard, they want that sense of a client-centered approach. And, hardly ever it's a case where a customer says, you know what, I am just done. I have not had sufficient support from the service provider, FSP, product house, admin house, etc., other service provider that may be conduit to the business relationship. I've had just no support. You'd rather end up in a situation where you've got this open relationship with a client where they can see you really do have their best interest at heart and that you're willing to work through the process with them. And in respect of that and in response to that, they are then willing to work openly with you through the process with the intention to resolve matters at hand. And more often than not, with a transparent procedure, you probably find yourself not only keeping the client, but enhancing the relationship that you have with that client. And very easy at that point then for that client to go out into the market and say, you know what, my guys that I'm dealing with are absolutely top notch. They take the time to consider not just the fact that there's a product party to the business relationship, but that there's a service party to the business relationship, which is held in high regard. So it's very easy through word of mouth that you might well attract through good process, more customers wanting to do business with you. So very key to understand that there are truly benefits that come from an effective complaints management or handling process. When we look at the complaints management framework, it's important that overall there are a number of objectives and or themes that we can see coming through the framework. But more importantly, in summary, the framework has to be effective and efficient. It must allow for fair and reasonable dealings. It must be informative and insightful. The process itself to lodge the grievance, complaint and or expression of dissatisfaction must be simple, must be accessible, It must be confidential. Dealings must be handled in a confidential nature. The process and procedure must be visible. It must be somewhere the client can easily go into a website, for example, find the process, find the step-by-step process that must be available to guide them through how the FSP provider, admin house, otherwise may want them to lodge their complaint and or expect the steps of the process to unfold in an orderly manner. The process must be handled objectively and impartially, and all dealings must happen in a timely manner. So when we're looking at the requirements of the framework, we are dealing with proportionality, accessibility, customer-centeredness. We're looking at responsiveness, objectivity, and fairness. We're looking at employee training and review. So review of the process and methodologies that are adopted by the organization, at least on an annual basis. Employee training of the process, procedure, methodology adopted by the establishment on an annual basis. We're looking at performance standards, confidentiality, remedies, restitutions, resolutions, recording, categorization of complaints, accountability, decision-making. So who's responsible and who's going to take the decisions? Using factual information to then articulate continuous improvements in service delivery and or the nature of the dealings within a product or product house or service provider, admin house that we're dealing with. It could stimulate improvements in respect of SLAs that are conduit to the business relationship. The framework must cater for an escalation and review process where perhaps the resolution is not fully satisfying the outcome that the customer may have expected, or perhaps where a complaint is outright rejected by an FSP provider, product house, admin house, etc., because the facts of the matter are invalidated or unjustified, for example. So where there is an opportunity for a client to escalate and or have a review of the matter concerned taking place, it may invite the senior leadership of the FSP and or provider, product house, admin house, or other service supplier, may invite the escalation channel into the process and or procedure to intervene in the matter, and or may even go further to invite the engagement of ombudsman schemes from the industry. So it might not be ombudsman schemes limited to the only regulatory authority that might come into the intervention of the matter, but most certainly it could be a case of, for example, an arbitrator, another person of legal stature that may be invited to intervene and act on behalf of the customer or complainant with the intention to resolve the matter. We were talking about the reporting of complaints. So certain complaints are reportable and others are not. So complaints that are generally able to be resolved within 5 business days from date of receipt of the complaint are typically recordable but non-reportable complaints. Complaints that are typically taking longer than 5 business days to resolve then become more complex in nature, perhaps require some planning and investigation in the resolution process, but more importantly, become a reportable complaint, and at any point in time may need to be scrutinized or taken further, at which point the facts of the matter would need to be available on demand, so that scrutiny could be offered, intervention can take place, with the interest then to work a way towards resolution. Allocation of responsibilities are important, so the framework must provide for an organogram, perhaps, depending on the size of the organization, who is going to deal with the complaints in the first instance, who's going to then deal with escalation of complaints, who's going to take care of the training and the policy and procedure in respect of complaints. So what is the general set of allocation of responsibilities that become key to each of the organizations who must have this in place in respect to the framework? At least on an annual basis, policy, process, methodology, procedure must be reviewed in respect to the complaints management framework, and then record keeping. Imposed on all FSPs, providers, admin houses, product houses, etc., the requisite requirement to keep records for at least a minimum of 5 years after the final response offered by the FSP is submitted to the client, and or restitution resolution remedies are offered and fulfilled. Records must be kept for 5 years. So it's quite important that the framework deals with all of these aspects that may come through the dealings of these channels. In respect of the complaints handling and resolution policy and supporting procedures, we're dealing with 3 pillars of focus here. And in each of the pillars, I've actually highlighted here on this particular slide what we believe to be the most important within that particular pillar of focus. So in the first instance, we are dealing with cultivating the right culture. And the most optimal way to deal with cultivating the right culture is to ensure staff commitment to the process. So you'll have in the organization, you'll have your senior leadership, you'll have your middle management, you'll have your representatives, and perhaps even representatives under supervision. It's important that there is a culture amongst the organization to, number one, and in the first instance, deal with matters in a composed, professional, empathetic manner. We don't know at any particular point in time what part of the business relationship may cause grievance on a particular client, customer, and or anybody acting on behalf of the customer in any instance. What would be the cause of that grievance and or concern and or dissatisfaction that may potentially bring into disrepute the relationship that the FSP provider, admin house, and so forth may be sharing with the client. But staff commitment is, we believe, the most important thing, but we're also dealing with in culture. We're talking about valuable information being used in different ways. So the information or the channel of feedback making available to clients, giving you access to information and or feedback to then use constructively to stimulate improvements within the organization and or perhaps elements of the supply chain of service delivery to the client. We're talking about recording and prioritizing the urgency of matters. We're talking about resources and complaints handling as a priority. We're talking about management responsibility and or the responsibility of a complaints officer. And all of that really sums up what we're looking for in terms of, or what the industry regulator would be looking for in terms of cultivating the right culture as far as the complaints management proceedings are expected to be constructed for the organization. When we're talking about the complaints handling system, we're talking about fairness, impartiality, confidentiality, transparency. Amongst that, we're also talking about is the process, procedure, methodology, is it all fit for purpose? Is it set out to achieve the correct outcomes in terms of the handling process and procedure? We're talking about efficiency and integration into the general business processes. We're talking about does the handling system allow for an extremely responsive approach from the organization? Does it consider the needs of clients, vulnerable clients and or otherwise? Does it articulate processes and procedures in terms of, should a client demonstrate unreasonable behavior in any way, how the FSP will construe that situation and how it will be viewed and how it will be dealt with within the complaints handling system? Is the process to submit a complaint, is it accessible? Is there awareness that has been created to clients to help them understand that if there's a grievance, if there's a problem, or if there's a feeling of discontent, displeasure in respect of the business relationship? So any part of it, remember we said in relation to the financial product or in relation to the financial service provided. So is there an awareness presenting options to the client in terms of how they may address those matters of concern? When we're dealing with complaints handling staff as the third pillar of focus, the most important part here is to have responsible persons nominated within the organization that have the professional ability to deal with and or skills and attributes to deal with matters of concern that will be raised by clients. So we're talking about somebody that can, again, respond to the client astutely, professionally, can reduce very technical jargon into simple language, something that is layman enough for your client, customer, complainant to understand. So imposed on us already in this industry is to break things down to a language that is easily understood by customers and or product providers and or admin houses and or other service suppliers party to the business relationship. But at the end of the day, in terms of treating customers fairly, a culture of client-centeredness, you certainly want to make things easy for your customer to understand. The skills and attributes required by somebody dealing with the complaints matters on behalf of the FSP must be somebody that can respond calmly, remain composed, remain professional, extract the factual elements from a very detailed, very noisy submission from a particular client. But when we're further dealing with complaints handling staff, we're also talking about ongoing training and learning within the organization. We're talking about other staff of the FSP. How is feedback utilized within the FSP to stimulate improvements in service delivery and or culture of the organization? We're talking about supervision experience. We're talking about the nature of vulnerability that may be found amongst either representatives of the organization and or or customers. So where there is a status of vulnerability in respect of customers, it's important that the person, either the complaints handler or the complaints officer or the most senior channel that might be involved in intervening in a complaints matter, do they understand the nature and complexity of the vulnerability that is the client's predisposition in any regard. So quite important, once again, for all facts and elements to be considered in terms of the methodology framework, procedures, policies, methodologies, and other mechanisms that might be used in terms of dealing with these matters on behalf of clients. So it's important that, again, the ethos and the sense of TCF must be coming through the process and procedure. It's almost inviting what we expect to see the framework of TCF to unfold into the future. So it must be almost invited into the process. You've got to almost demonstrate all of that on an ongoing basis in respect of dealings with your customers. It is important that, on that note, that we start to consider each establishment unto their own. I mean, naturally, there won't be any one FSP provider, product house, admin house, or other service provider that might be conduit to a business relationship that'll handle the process in exactly the same way. But it's important to articulate a step-by-step process and methodology for the organization in terms of how this will be handled, how these matters will be raised, how responses will take place to clients, and just a guideline in terms of how you can start to think about setting out that process for your establishment in respect of dealing with these matters into the future. In the first instance, you have to have the ability to acknowledge all complaints in a timely manner. In the second, the framework and methodology must provide for the ability to assess the nature of the complaint and prioritize the urgency of the complaint. A routine complaint is something that can be handled more seamlessly in a shorter time frame, and ultimately something that can be dealt with within 5 business days. Where something is more complex, it does require planning and investigation. Now, when we are planning for the investigation, we are looking at the nature, we're looking at the factual elements of the complaint that caused this matter to be complex in nature. We're then also planning the investigation. So what is the direction that you as the FSP or establishment, product house, admin house should take in response to complaints? So once you've done the assessment, you have then set out the project plan, so to speak, in terms of how this matter will be handled, and then you're going to commence the investigation further. Once we look at investigating the actual matter, by that time, you'll have responded to the client and at least given them clear direction in terms of what are the facts that are being assessed in the matter, what are the timeframes that are being worked towards, and who are the responsible persons for handling the matter at hand. And then offer that response to the client and clear direction in terms of what is going to be taking place in order to achieve resolution in the matter. So ultimately, these are guidelines in terms of the step-by-step process you want to find your establishment adhering to. But at the end of the day, once you've offered that final response to the client, so you've got acknowledgement, assess, plan, and investigate and respond. So, and some of the process and procedures may take a little longer than others, which will then determine whether the complaint is routine in nature or more complex in nature. But very important that at the end of it, you then start to reflect internally based on the factual elements of the potentially various complaints. Maybe it was 1, maybe it was 5 or 10 in the same week. But what are we doing on an ongoing basis in our establishment to then understand in follow-up to these proceedings? Are we dealing with customer service issues? Are we dealing with systemic issues? So are we dealing with perhaps party to the organization is a representative under supervision and they've not yet had full training? Perhaps client etiquette training is something that is required. Perhaps it's the way somebody has been dealing with a customer that has caused grievance and or concern within the client business relationship. Or alternatively, is it process, procedure, protocol? Is it an SLA perhaps that is misleading and should be updated? Or perhaps is it impossible to live up to the expectation that has been created for a client in respect of the SLA, systems, process, procedures, etc.? I mean, for example, if a claim should be taking 5 business days in relation to a loss event on an insurance claim, and the claim takes 3 weeks to resolve, that is most certainly going to cause a problem. But you'd have to, as the FSP, be able to articulate to the client why it's taken 3 weeks. Is it missing information in the claim? Is it a validation process? Is it a two-tier sign-off and approval process for a claim to be paid? You know, what is there that perhaps has not been communicated to the client to help them understand why this claim is now taking longer than it was expecting to take? I've already mentioned earlier in the presentation that as a CTB client, you'd have access to the electronic complaints register held within COTIV. You would automatically be able to log into COTIV. You'd be able to go through to the drop-down, giving you access to the list of registers that are embedded within COTIV for your use. And on the drop-down, you will find the complaints management register. On the top right-hand side of the first screen that you will see, labeled complaints, top right-hand side gives you a button to add a new complaint. And in respect of that, once you started adding the complaint, it will take you to fields and or questions that you need to respond to by selecting from certain options and or including filling in manually certain fields on the system then to open the complaint, so to speak. Once the complaint is open and the first section is completed, it will then push you onto reviewing the complaint. It will then push you further on to creating an outcome for the complaint. If at any point in time you do get stuck in the handling process and or the lodging process, you'll see nicely embedded in the system, there is a tab that you can then click on, or a link that you can click on to the complaints management guide also embedded in the system. CTB is currently enhancing certain features of the complaints management register, thus more seamlessly enabling the handling and the recording of the complaints that may come to the attention of the FSP. So quite important. This section will deal with the source of complaints. It will deal with the policy name, procedure, reference number, policy number, the nature of the complaint, the factual elements of the complaint, evidence of the complaint, that if it is available in writing, to be able to upload that into a central register where records, if necessary, can be easily accessed for scrutiny if so required, or where other intervention of regulatory authorities are then invited to the resolution process. So very important that one is able to carefully, accurately access the records relating to a complaint, and very well established in the COTIV system, it is very possible to do that from a central process. When we are looking at the customer complaint submission process, there are expected timeframes that one would have to work towards in respect of responses and or resolutions. So we've already said that acknowledgements of all matters need to be within 24 hours. Assessment of matters need to be within 48 hours, and a response to the client in terms of who's handling the matter, how the matter is going to be handled, the factual details which are being assessed, and the timeframes in particular that the client may expect a matter to be dealt with. We are talking about, if it's a routine complaint, it should not take more than 5 business days to resolve the complaint, in which case it's a recordable complaint, but not necessarily a reportable complaint. Complaints that are more complex in nature require planning and investigation and should be responded to, aside from acknowledgement, which is within 24 hours, and further direction within the next 48 hours. But a further response should be offered to clients within 30 business days from receipt, and further progress communication at least on a weekly basis. So complex complaints, any FSP, product house, admin house, other service supplier have got a maximum of 6 weeks to offer a response, at least consider a response in respect of a complex complaint. And furthermore, if the complaint cannot be resolved, then within 10 days, offer the option for the client to escalate and or invite the engagement of the ombudsman schemes in relation to the matter as may be fit for the nature of the complaint or matter at hand. When something is resolved to the full satisfaction of the client, you as the FSP establishment, provider, product house, admin house has got the ability to ask the client for a response that the matter at hand has been resolved to their full satisfaction. And on that basis, you may request the client to respond, but understandably that, unless again you are sharing a very reciprocal relationship in relation to your client and the business relationship, it's important to also cater for the fact that you might not get a response from your client. In some instances, you do get very, very unreasonable people, and they, as much as you would have done everything reasonably possible to resolve the matter, you may have offered resolution, restitution, you may have offered a remedy. And as far as your opinion and process and procedure goes, you have fully fulfilled your obligation in respect of the complaints handling process and proceedings thereto. And whatever resolution, restitution, remedy you have offered, you have in fact fulfilled the undertakings that you have offered the client in that regard. And on that basis, you are entitled to ask the client for an acknowledgement of agreement that the matter is resolved to their satisfaction, but you might not get it. So you don't want to go through the point of irritating the client further to get that response. You might ask once or twice, but at some point you're going to respond to the client and say, well, we've offered this restitution based on these reasons. Here is the explanation for our findings, and we have fulfilled the undertakings in our response to you with the intention to resolve the matter. And in lieu of the silence or lack of response or acknowledgement from you, Mr. Client, the FSP will deem the matter to be resolved, and that you as the client have accepted that such matter is resolved to your agreement. In the event that you deem the matter to be resolved, your response cannot include a request to the client to waive any further rights or interventions that they may have available to them, even on the basis that something may be resolved to the best of your ability. It's important to understand that a client will still have further recourse to invite other interventions of regulatory authorities and or an arbitrator and or other persons of legal authority into the equation with the intention to resolve something or get to a point where perhaps they understand that this is now to their satisfaction, it's the best that they're going to get in the situation, or perhaps to really find that what has been put on offer to them with the intention to resolve is in fact the final outcome. So at no point can anybody ask the client to waive their further rights which they reserve automatically in respect of inviting escalation and review of the process. Where matters need to be escalated, again, once the matter is escalated, in this case we've used an example being to the CEO of the organization. As we said earlier, it could be a KI, it could be a managing director, it could be an operations director, it could be another person of executive leadership or seniority within the business where that person is capable and has the capacity and or knowledge to deal with complaints in their very nature, however variable the nature of these cases might be. When the matter is, however, escalated to the CEO, in this case, in this example, acknowledgement must be offered within 24 hours. Review of the matter must be taking place within 1 week, and then a final response and or further response must take place within 10 business days. So usually when a matter is then escalated within the organization, it is expected to be that a copy into the complaints officer must be included in the escalation submission by the client, as well as the external compliance officer, in which case that could be any compliance officer within CTB as a CTB client or to you. In this case, we've used just an example as Charmaine, but it could be Lynette, it could be JP, it could be Rainer, it could be any one of the CTB compliance officers that are responsible for assisting you in your road to compliance. So it's important that at any point in time, customers do realize that there is an escalation process, but they have to, at the very first opportunity, give you as the FSP an opportunity to resolve before matters are escalated. So when we're talking about escalated matters, any failure to resolve within a total period of 6 weeks and 10 days. So the and 10 days is to articulate the final response and then make that response available to the client, or communicate that response and or outcome to the client. In the case of a rejection of a complaint, it's important to communicate clearly the decision with a thorough explanation of reasons thereof, and then present any further remedies available to the consumer of financial products. So at that point, and at that instance, within the maximum time frame being reached, as an example, the client must be referred to the relevant ombudsman schemes, where they may then lodge the matter and request for further intervention within 6 months of the final response from the FSP, and at which point that will then be escalated to an industry authority. So it's also important that FSPs are able to communicate intelligently with the industry authorities where necessary, because a complaint, as we've said, may not be directed at you. It may well be a past grievance from a past business relationship, whereby you're able to then offer your client guidance in respect of how they could then address the complaint, give the FSP the opportunity to resolve the complaint, and or invite the ombudsman schemes. There are many FSPs who take on new clients and assist them, for example, with the submission to the ombudsman schemes, to then intervene in a matter which may not be a current matter directed at you in respect of a new business relationship, but certainly aiding in support and assistance to a matter and or grievance that was party to another FSP and a past business relationship. So that matter then becomes important to help your clients identify, current and or future clients, identify where your involvement is in respect of, in particular in this instance, in this example, past complaints that may bring about new business for you, because you can make resolutions available, or at least you can resolve old matters, but at the same time help them as the customer and or complainant find resolve in respect of the previous business relationship in whatever nature and or form may be adequate and or suitable. Okay, so it's quite important that you're able to work openly and transparently with your client and enable your client to communicate intelligently in respect of various matters that may be deemed an expression of dissatisfaction, whether directed at you or indirectly to a past business relationship. So very important to go through all of the facts relating to the case and determine where you're able and willing to get involved in a client matter that perhaps is not a matter directed at your FSP, okay, or your establishment, or a product provider or service supplier might be party to the new business relationship. So quite important on that basis. This is just a cross-section of the various ombudsman schemes available in the market. Many of you familiar with the ombudsman schemes or adjudicators that might become involved in the complaints management process and or escalation of sorts. But as we said earlier, it would not be the intervention or escalation or review process may not necessarily be limited only to the ombudsman schemes in the market, but may well include another person of legal authority, an arbitrator, for example, that may need to support the customer and or complainant in respect of a grievance, concern, dissatisfaction, or an official complaint that must be dealt with fairly and adequately. Furthermore, in the submission process, we're also talking about what does a complaint relate to. So the same set of questions and or criteria can be applied to the FSP, provider, product or service supplier. So just to go through a non-exhaustive list here, quite important to understand that the complaint may relate to a failure to comply with an agreement, a contravention, or failure to comply with a law, a rule, a code of conduct. It could be in relation to maladministration within the FSP, willful action, negligent action, failure to act, or is the cause of action, is it something that has caused harm? So is it the action or lack of action that has caused harm, prejudice, or distress, or a substantial inconvenience on the client? And or is there any element at any point in time where the customer may have been treated unfairly? So the same set of criteria that would apply to an FSP would naturally apply to a product provider or service provider conduit to the business relationship that may or may not be directly client facing. So quite important that at any point in time, any establishment that is a participating establishment in the financial services industry as a whole is then prepared with a process, procedure, and methodology in relation to dealing with complaints. They're quite important on that basis. The submission process should also include the ability for the complaint to be categorized. Now, this is a non-exhaustive list once again, and categorization can be inclusive of the design of a product or service or related service, including fees, brokerage fees, commissions, premiums charged. It could be in relation to information provided to a client or lack of information provided to a client. It could be in relation to advice, the performance of a product, or simply the lapsing of a product where there are material consequences as a result of a product lapsing. Is it in relation to the complaints handling proceedings of an FSP? Is it a delay in claims processing, as an example? So the SLA, which a client may expect an organization to adhere to. So again, the same categorization can be asked of the FSP, can also be asked of the product or service supplier in respect of categorizing the complaints. Now, this is quite a non-exhaustive list, so it's important to think a little bit more creatively in some instances and perhaps more big picture. It's quite, there can be, for example, a complaint or a termination of business relationship as a result of various dealings. And just by way of example, it wouldn't be unusual for an FSP to receive a termination of business relationship, for example, that dealt with the premiums of the product, that dealt with the performance of the product, that dealt with the turnaround times in respect of a claim. However, there are other instances that could be included in categorization, and that would be, as an FSP provider, product house, admin house, other service supplier, conduit to the business relationship, there are items in the legislation that are already imposed on financial services providers in general to adhere to. For example, honesty, integrity, acting with due skill, care, and diligence in respect of the business relationship. And the moment that business relationship is somewhat tarnished in respect of a question being raised, for example, in respect of the FSP or the representatives of the FSP's integrity, then you've got to understand that this categorization is much more than what you expect it to be. It may not simply be a tick box. It may not simply be a straightforward categorization. But what is important, again, is that there is transparency in the process, that we're dealing with the factual elements of the process. And if a client is making a claim against the integrity of an FSP, for example, they have to be able to factually and fully substantiate that claim so that it may be dealt with adequately. I mean, can you imagine a client writes to one of the ombudsman schemes and questions the integrity of the organization, that which one already must comply with in respect of the various dealings and requirements of the authority to remain an operational business in this industry. So certainly factual is call of the day as far as elements and or matters relating to grievances and or concerns are concerned. So it's important, again, to remind clients of where complaints could be found, perhaps how those complaints would be dealt with, to remind clients we're only dealing with factual elements. We're not going to respond emotionally to the matter. However, it's important that at all dealings that the matters are dealt with reasonably and fairly, but with the interest of resolving matters for the best interest of all parties at hand, whilst upholding the integrity of the industry as a whole. But not only the industry, also the organization and the establishment that is party to the business relationship at the end of the day. With every complaint and process, there must be an outcome of a complaint. So there are various outcomes. The outcomes could be one of these on the list. It could be a combination of these on the list. But to give you an example, an outcome could be a compensation payment. It could be a goodwill payment. So a compensation and or a goodwill payment is a monetary payment or a payment in the form of a benefit or service by a provider to the complainant. And in some instances, specifically to compensate for a proven or estimated financial loss incurred as a result of a provider's action or lack of action, or with the intention to resolving a particular complaint. As we said earlier, a complaint can be rejected outright. If the facts of the complaint are unjustified or invalidated, it's important that you're able to respond to the client, that your process or procedure provides for, that your response to the client will be that the matter will not be taken any further, no further action will be offered, no further time will be offered on the matter. It is rejected as a result of the facts being unjustified and invalidated, and that or where the complainant does not participate in the resolution process. So any of that can come to light in terms of why a particular matter would be rejected. But it's important that you're able to articulate that to a client with the intention to advise them that the matter will not take further course and action with the intention to resolve because of the facts at hand. When a complaint is upheld, it can be upheld partially or wholly in favor of the complainant. It's important at that point, whether partially or wholly, that there is explicit acceptance by the customer or complainant in this instance that the matter is resolved. So we are asking the client for acknowledgement that the matter is resolved. Or we need to, after asking for the client, after we have offered restitution, resolution, or remedy, and we have fulfilled those undertakings to the client, it's important that at any point in, or at a point in time on the matter, you're able to advise the client that we have done all of the above, and in lieu of the silence and or lack of response or lack of acknowledgement of our intentions to resolve, provided that you have fulfilled the restitution, resolution, remedies that are being offered to the client, important that you can deem the matter to be resolved as such and accepted as such by the client. So remember I said earlier that you've got the entitlement to ask the client for acknowledgement, but if they simply don't respond, without irritating the client, without tarnishing the business relationship, without causing the matter to be further aggrieved, it's also important then to deem the matter to a point of closure until the client then perhaps expresses further grievance or invites further parties and or interventions into the matter at hand. All undertakings by the provider to resolve the complaint must have been met, or at least an explicit indication of the satisfaction with potential arrangements. You can make arrangements with the client, provided the client deems those arrangements to be acceptable and that such undertakings will be met within an acceptable time frame. You can, under those instances, make arrangements to the client, commit to those undertakings in writing, and on explicit agreement and acceptance with the customer complainant and or anyone acting on behalf of the customer being accepted. As long as there is that agreement, those arrangements can be made and then must be adhered to in the business relationship. So at any point in time, there could be variable outcomes for various complaints in nature. However, they do need to be dealt with in a formal manner and in respect of the proceedings at hand that are set out within the organization and within the methodology and procedure that is then adopted by the organization to handle these dealings in a fair and reasonable manner. But ultimately, with the ethos and that we expect to be coming through from TCF and in alignment with the roadmap that is then envisaged towards TCF. So we can see the big focus here is client-centeredness, treating customers fairly, but in every instance, trying to ensure that there is improvement in dealings with financial customers and the harmony of the industry and certainly the integrity of the establishment, the FSP, the provider, product house, admin house, but ultimately the industry as a whole. And on that basis, I'd like to thank you for the privilege of your time this evening. I'd like to also share with you that the Compliance Toolbox will be making available an information set with tools and templates and policy guidelines, together with an extract of the notice amendments of the GCOC, together with a recorded version of the presentation and an invitation, if you have questions, to then publish your questions to us by email to one of our compliance officers with the intention to contribute to our frequently asked questions and answers document, which will then be made available after these sessions to our general C2B customer base. However, if you personally are enhancing a process and procedure within the organization or attempting to establish a new one and would like to seek some guidance in the process, you're very welcome to reach out to us as well in that regard. We will offer guidance and procedure, but the templates and so forth that we will offer are fairly self-explanatory and fairly useful, something that must specifically be articulated and customized within to your organization. So within your organization, establish the appropriate process and procedure that should be adopted by the organization. On that note, again, thank you for the privilege of your time. We value our interactions with our customers, and we certainly look forward to more interaction with you on this topic as a C2B client now and at the earliest possible convenience as you may find it necessary to establish these processes within your business. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day further.